Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, what time is it where you are and where in the world are you listening from? Dim the lights, pull the blanket to your shoulders, let the fan hum and let the day soften. It's cold in the timbered room, a thin ribbon of candle smoke drifting upward. Outside, the street is damp and slow. You breathe, and time loosens its grip as we drift into a quieter century. Story 1. The Barber Surgeon of Cheapside, a London chair and a pelican. You wake to the faint rasp of a whetstone. It is barely light, and Cheapside has not yet found its daytime thunder. The booth is narrow, beams low enough that you duck without thinking. A board hangs outside with a painted basin and a razor, the sign by which you know you have found a barber, which in this century is also a place where small surgeries happen. Bloodletting, cupping, lancing, and what concerns most of the city at one time or another, drawing a bad tooth. Inside, the order is practical and spare. A stool sits angled toward the window where the daylight is best. The leather seat is polished by years of shifting hips and clenched hands. A rope dangles from a peg. Some customers grip it until their knuckles pale. On a shelf you notice rags boiled and dried stiff, rolls of linen for binding, a jar of salt, a stoppered vial of strong wine, and a mortar rubbed smooth by crushed herbs. Near the brazier a small iron lies warming, not red, just ready. The air holds a faint tang, vinegar, sweat, spiced oil. The man who keeps this place is more than a barber and less than a physician, a craftsman of small calamities. In London, the barber's craft has the city's leave to treat those matters that do not demand a university seal. They shear, bleed, lance boils, dress wounds, and when compelled by pain, pull teeth. They know the shape of jawbone by touch and the persuasion of tools by habit. No one here promises miracles. They promise a tolerable morning. On the bench rests the instrument that will matter most today, a dental pelican. It looks like a small beaked bird, a lever with a curved claw to hook a tooth and a padded bolster to fit against the gum. It is a tool described by learned surgeons of the last century, refined in the hands of men who have watched molars split and roots cling like stubborn thorns. It is both delicate and brutal, made to shift the balance of force until bone relents. People arrive in a trickle, wrapped against the damp, touching their jaws, speaking carefully. A fishmonger with a swelling at the angle of the mandible, his left cheek thickened by an abscess that tendered overnight. A maid with a front tooth darkened and loose after a fall on the step. An older man with a mouth full of worn enamel. The bread here contains grit from millstone dust, and life wears down biting edges as surely as years wear kneecaps. Carries, too, appears, especially where sweetness has made its cautious entrance into wealthy tables. Pain is democratic enough, though. Rich and poor sit on the same stool when the night finally forces a decision. You take the corner by the window, candlelight traded for a pale wash of morning. The barber, broad hand, careful eyes, asks little. How long? Where exactly? He presses a knuckle into the gum, taps a tooth with the handle of a spoon, reads the flinch. There is a ritual to what follows. He rinses a cloth in warmed wine, swabs the mouth, and an apprentice holds a basin ready. You note the way he measures the pelican's claw against the tooth, rehearsing without words the path of the lever. So many things in this age depend on angles rather than promises. For pain, there are degrees and compromises. The city knows herbs that dull, willow bark infusions that take the edge from the blood, a drop of clove-scented oil pressed near the gum, henbane seeds smoldered in a small dish to narcotize with bitter smoke. But certainty belongs to neither patient nor barber, and more is left to endurance than to the neat assurances that future centuries will take for granted. The barber asks you to grip the rope if you like. He tucks a folded rag between your molars on the opposite side, reminding you to breathe through your nose. You feel the pelican set against the tooth as a brace sets against a stubborn hinge. The bolster presses the gum and the jawbone beneath. The beak finds purchase under the crown's broken rim. The barber's hand is large but not hasty. He rocks the instrument gently, testing. The ache becomes a pressure that blooms, a demanding weather inside your head. The apprentice touches your shoulder and nods, a gesture repeated countless times in this room. What you cannot see, you imagine. the buried roots curled down and back, a small forest of vessels and fibers clinging to their house. The barber knows that if he pulls straight up, the crown may shear and splinter, leaving roots like arrows under earth. Instead, he levers gradually, drawing the tooth sideways to disrupt the hold of the periodontal threads, then up and out in a motion that uses the jaw as fulcrum and the tool as persuasion. It is not the kind of knowledge recorded in a university commentary. It is the accumulating wisdom of hands that have learned from mistakes and from slow improvements in iron and wood. There is a wet sound, less dramatic than stories tell, and then an absence, a space into which you breathe for the first time without the sharp lightning of pressure. The barber inspects the tooth, checking whether the roots have come complete. If they have, he murmurs a quiet phrase of thanks you barely catch. If they have not, the mourning lengthens and different tools come forward. A small hook, a probe, the iron warmed to a kiss on an oozing vessel to still the bleeding. He packs the socket with lint soaked in wine and salt, perhaps dusted with powdered myrrh or alum to check blood and sweeten the breath. While you press a cloth to your cheek, the room returns to its other business. The fishmonger watches, deciding whether to stay. The maid traces her tongue over a loosened incisor and decides to wait a day more. On the wall, a small notice warns against making a mess in the lane. The city wardens will fine any craftsman who throws bloody rags into the gutter. Even in pain, there is municipal order. The apprentice pours the basin out discreetly into a pail. The brazier is fed a pinch of charcoal. Somewhere outside, a bell counts the hour. The barber will be paid in pennies if the job is simple, more if it is difficult, and sometimes in fish or a loaf when coin is scarce. He will keep the tooth in a little bowl. Some customers will take it, superstitious of where pieces of themselves may travel. Now and then someone asks to see the worm that country lore blames for toothache, that tiny culprit said to gnaw inside the root. The barber does not argue doctrine. He shows what is there, a shard of root, a grapeseed clot, a fragment of tartar, and allows the mind to make its peace. Outside, the street wakes fully. Cartwheels, a cry for eels, a quarrel about the price of wool. Inside, the arithmetic of pain continues, careful, repetitive, necessary. You rest, cotton bitter between gum and tongue, listening to the steady scrape of the whetstone over iron. It is not heroic, not glorious, not the sort of thing to make a chronicle. Yet it is the quiet hinge on which ordinary life turns back toward tolerable. In a city without Novocaine or sterile gleam, what keeps hands steady and small rooms tidy enough to risk again tomorrow? You return the next market day, the packing in your socket smaller now, the taste of wine and salt fatting. The street is busier and the barber's painted basin sways above the lane like a little moon. Inside, the shop feels familiar. You notice things you missed before. A narrow book with cracked leather, a small reliquary badge pinned along the beam, a strip of parchment inked with tidy ordinances. In London, even pain has paperwork. The barber explains, mostly to the apprentice but loudly enough for you to gather it, that the city's barbers are watched by wardens, that fees are set, that there are limits to what may be claimed on a signboard. They trim beards, yes, they bleed at the elbow when the season's regimen suggests. They cup the shoulders, lance a whitlow, bind a sprain, stitch a small gash, and when the case insists, fetch out a tooth. For deeper matters there are surgeons. For learned disputation there are physicians with Latin and seals. The barber's authority is local and practical. The wardens fine those who throw blood into the street or leave rags where dogs nose them. You sit on the leather stool not for another extraction, but because the barber wishes to look again, to change the dressing and test the gum with a careful finger. He asks if you slept. You did, which he calls a good sign. He moistens a twist of lint with vinegar and wine and powders it with alum, pressing it gently into the socket to staunch any late weeping. He recommends that you keep your head warm and avoid biting hard crust on that side for a week. Advice is small, precise, and unadorned, another kind of medicine. On the shelf near the brazier, the instruments are few but telling. The pelican rests in its place, brass bright where cloth has polished it, wood dark where palms have remembered it. Beside it are forceps with blunt beaks for smaller teeth and a simple elevator to nudge a stubborn root. There is a sharp hook for broken remnants, a probe to test a pocket, and a file to smooth a jagged edge that snags the tongue. No abundance, only what has proven its right to remain. You watch the apprentice rub a thin sheen of oil into iron to keep damp air at bay. The barber mentions a name you have heard in tavern talk and market gossip, Guy de Chauliac, the French master whose chirurgia is copied and traded in towns where scholars converse. Guy gathered what Greek, Arab, and Latin writers knew and set it orderly, including counsel on teeth. Do not attack a sound tooth, he warns. Beware of breaking the jaw by careless force. Prefer loosening to tearing. Respect the root's curve. Leave well-anchored teeth to time unless decay or abscess compels. Your barber's copy is not complete. Parts are glossed by another hand. Still, the book lends words to what the hand already suspects. On the beam above the chair hangs the small badge you noticed. St. Apollonia's familiar emblem, a tooth, sometimes a pair of pincers, patroness to those in jaw pain and to those who tend them. Many of the city's faithful have invoked her since the last century. The barber does not make a show of it, nor does he mock. In a room where tools are levers and cloth is counted by the ell, a saint's badge marks solidarity more than spectacle. A reminder that pain crowds even the orderly places, and that courage is not nothing. He talks of remedies asked for in the interval before a person consents to the chair. Mouthwashes that come from apothecaries on Soper Lane, distilled wine sharpened with vinegar, decoctions of sage, rosemary, or mint, myrrh dissolved to sweeten, alum to tighten the flesh. Clove oil, expensive but prized among those who can manage it, dabbed sparingly near the gum. There is henbane smoked, its harshness loosening the knot between jaw and will. There is opium where a physician prescribes, rare and not to be trusted beyond the hour. Most rely on time and resolve. The apprentice nods, reciting, warm, rinse, rest. If swelling hardens, send for the chair before night. The city's mouths tell their own census. The wealthy, with more sugar at table and softer breads, show decay in fissures and between teeth. The poor grind flour that carries millstone grit and live with broad, flat wear and exposed dentin. Almost all pick at meat with quills or slender sticks. Toothpicks are for sale at fairs, carved from bone and boxwood. Powdered eggshell appears in some tooth-cleansing recipes, as does burnt salt. In the winter, when smoke clings to everything, breath has a different quality on the street, and people stand closer to ovens just to smell something clean. Complications visit however careful the hand. A tooth fractures at the gum and leaves barbed roots that lodge deep. The barber coaxes them with a hook no thicker than a scribe's penknife, knowing that patience is safer than zeal. A jaw creaks ominously if iron bears against bone instead of crown. He changes angle, shifts fulcrum, rests, resumes. Sometimes the socket bleeds more than modestly. He uses pressure and lint, and if a vessel will not settle, he touches the warm iron briefly, taint of singe mingling with wine. Infection is a word not yet shaped the way future centuries will use it, but putrefaction is feared. Vinegar and salt, sunlight and time are his allies. Trade brings changes as slow as masonry settles. Instruments are a little better made. Angles are refined by those who file and temper for a living. The pelican itself, not ancient but securely of recent centuries, is found with different claws to match molars and incisors. Across the sea, Arabic texts describe splints wired to stabilize broken jaws, and in some places goldsmiths lend their hands to fashioning such wires. In London, a goldsmith on Foster Lane has entirely other work, yet rumors of wiring a loose tooth with a thread of metal to give it time to settle do make their way into shop talk. Most of the city still trusts to extraction when daily bread cannot be chewed without a hiss of pain. Once, the barber says, a man came in after 2 nights with a hard swelling under the tongue, his speech slowed and his mouth not opening fully. The barber lanced the underside carefully with a small, keen blade, relieving a flood that smelled of rot and relief at once. He washed with wine until the water ran pale and told the man to sleep propped, to keep the mouth clean as purse strings allow. The man returned 3 days later with easier jaw hinge and clearer eyes. No marvel, just a better chance at supper. In this shop, survival is often a series of slightly improved evenings. After you, a woman enters with a child whose face is blotched and hot. The tooth is small and new, the gum around it puffed. The barber will not pull a child's tooth if he can help it. He counsels warm cloths and a rinse, then has the apprentice make a small poultice of crumb and milk to ease the ache until the fever tilts. He sends them away with a blessing shaped like a list, practical as a tally slate. Not every problem has a tool for it today. Some rely on waiting without surrender. The city calendar turns on saints' days and market days. On St. Apollonia's, the barber sets a small candle beneath her badge and allows himself to sit a moment without the whetstone. He thinks of hands before his, and of hands after, and of the quiet arithmetic that never ends while people have teeth and bread needs chewing. The apprentice watches the flame and glances at the pelican in its place, as if it were a promise of employment and a warning both. By the door, the parchment with ordinances curls at the corner. The wardens may visit this quarter next week to inspect measure and cleanliness, to scold about rags, to remind the craft that reputation is a kind of medicine too. The barber ties a bundle of linens with a care that suggests the inspection matters. He knows patients can choose a loud tooth drawer at a fair, a man with a drum and painted hats. He knows one mishandled jaw can spoil a decade of quiet trade. Outside, Cheapside swells into its afternoon argument. Inside, a thin fillet of sunlight slides along the edge of the pelican's beak. You rise a little tender and thank him. He nods, already turning to a man whose hand rests on his cheek, thumb pressed just below the ear, an old gesture. The apprentice steadies the stool, the basin is made ready, and the careful dance resumes. Elsewhere, in halls where books breathe, scholars argue about the nature of pain. Here, the jaw decides. When the wardens, rules, and a saint's badge and a single good tool share the same low ceiling, which truly keeps this room safe enough to trust with a mouth you must use tomorrow. You return weeks later not as a patient but as a quiet witness. Cheapside rings with spring voices, the barber's basin swings. He nods you toward the market green where another kind of tooth drawing earns its bread. A drum taps. A man in a red coat performs courage. His board promises painless marvels. A rope is knotted to a post. The pelican shines like a small beak. You stand with the others. The showman pours sentences like ale. He passes a bottle to the seated volunteer, half chosen for need, half for spectacle. The pelican's claw searches under the gum while the drum rolls. The lever turns and the crowd leans. When the tooth comes, he flings it high as if it were a coin minted by bravery. Laughter follows. A scrap of cloth swipes blood with theatrical ease. Pain becomes a story told in the lane. Back in the shop, the same act is ordinary. The barber's boast is a ledger of outcomes, not gasps. From a drawer he shows you a lesson. A sheared crown smoothed by years of rubbing, twin roots fused like a wishbone. He tells of a jaw that complained when iron pressed wrong and of a night spent with warm cloths, waiting for the hinge to forgive. He recalls a man who postponed the chair until fever forced the door, and how wine, patience, and drainage finally turned him back toward sleep. Seasons revolve. Midsummer brings swelling, autumn brings grit, winter hardens bread. The pelican's bolster is repadded. The apprentice learns that a pause between pressures matters more than muscle. A traveling surgeon leaves a slimmer hook, kinder to narrow roots. The little book is glossed again. Rinse before, rinse after. Turn, do not yank. Touch gum with clove if it can be had. Avoid setting metal against bone. Beyond the lane, the craft shifts by slow decree. Across Europe, writers describe teeth more clearly, and Arabic cautions echo in Latin. Guy de Chauliac's counsel spreads wherever copying hands are busy. The instrument in your barber's hand still answers most cases, yet news arrives of keys that torque teeth rather than lever them, and of wire used to steady a loose incisor. Change comes like tide at slack water, noticed only in retrospect. For most mouths, Difference is counted in supper. A careful extraction means stew without flinching and sleep without the pulse in the jaw. A hasty one means splinters, swelling, and a week of grim patience. A woman who can bite bargains better. A mason who can sleep is steadier on a scaffold. A child spared a violent morning returns years later without dread. Small victories accumulate into the health of a street. Now that your own ache has faded, you hear how much of the barber's day is speech. Rinse after the evening meal. If coin allows, ask the apothecary for wine and sage. Clean between teeth with a sliver of wood or a feather quill. Keep the head warm at night. Beware sweetness, which is dear twice, once at market and again when it rents a room in a molar. He keeps a ledger of exchanges that would not interest a banker. A hen at Michaelmas stands for a winter extraction. A mended gutter pays for a spring lancing. Toothache does not wait for wages, and the shop survives on the understanding that relief, like bread, can be bought on credit. On a rainy day you ask what he does when heat climbs the jaw after a drawing, swallowing grows stiff and breath sours. He answers with candor. If there is a place to open, he opens. He washes with wine, persuades drainage, keeps the body warm, prays. Sometimes the fever breaks, sometimes it does not. Honesty lives in the same room as the brazier and the rope. Years fold. The apprentice becomes master. A new pelican rests beside the old, its beak a shade finer, its wood less cracked. Ordinances are recopied and nailed straighter. In later reigns, barbers and surgeons are joined, then parted. Farther on, the tooth is claimed by a craft that calls itself dentistry. The pelican retires. The dental key has its century. Later, gentler geometries replace both. Yet the quiet intention, angle, patience, restraint, travels unchanged. You leave London and return. The river smells unchanged. In a fashionable street, you glimpse a glass case holding a pelican like the one you remember, now a relic. A brass pole spirals outside. Inside, mirrors multiply light. You think of the low room with beams to duck, of the barber oiling iron in the dusk, of the rope's pale wear. At home, you raise a cup and chew without calculation. You map privately the long wake behind that missing tooth. Meals taken, sleep found, words spoken clearly at market. You think about the plain economy by which a tool keeps labor flowing, tempers sweet and bargains possible. You picture a modern chair that hisses softly, where a needle pauses pain, where water runs clear, where instruments are wrapped in folded paper and light sits beside steel. Behind that chair you can still see a stool by a window. The shop closes. The brazier draws down. Rain ticks on the lane and carries every faint odor toward the river. The pelican is wiped, set back on its shelf, and becomes only shape and memory until morning. In your mouth the healed socket no longer calls attention. Absence has become a steady presence. You sleep, and somewhere a man wakes, hand to cheek, measuring whether today is the day he trades dread for a few minutes of practiced leverage. Tonight a toothbrush waits by porcelain, quiet as any relic. Nylon bristles, a drift of mint, a measured swirl of fluoride. Even that small ritual traces back to the room with the rope. What broader piece of everyday life still turns, unnoticed, on tools this simple and on hands this patient? Story 2. The Abbey Infirmary, teeth, psalms, and cautery in a Benedictine house. You wake before dawn to the hollow thud of a wooden clapper, the infirmary bell's quieter cousin sparing the sick from sharper sound. The hall is long, rafters soot-dark, window shutters half ajar to a thread of chill air. Your bed is a low pallet with linen that has been boiled in lye and dried near the bakehouse. The smell is clean in the plain way of wood ash and sun. Your cheek tells its own weather, that thick tide beneath the molar, a pulse that keeps its own hour, indifferent to matins, to lauds, to prime. Across the hall a lamp brims with tallow. The infirmary moves carefully among the beds, counting by habit who has eaten, who has slept, who will need a word with the prior. His office is practical, tender, and regulated. 1 foot in medicine, 1 in the rule. He keeps a narrow table set with his day, a ledger for rations, a folded parchment of recipes, the monastery's physic, a small chest of jars labeled by a slow hand. The labels are the names of leaves you can picture in the garden, salvia, ruta, mentha, botanica, plantago. There are also jars whose names traveled farther: alumen, mirha, cinnamomum. Each is accounted for by weight, by charity, by season. He greets you with a whisper, the way all speech happens in this room, words like small birds that should not be startled. He sets a cloth in a bowl of warmed wine and vinegar and tests it with the inside of his wrist. He bids you hold it under your jaw where the swelling sits. Heat coaxes patience, he says. His fingers are broad, nails blunt, the hands of a gardener more than a court physician. You know he has a key to the herb garden gate and to the locked cupboard where spices rest against the wall of the warming room. The garden is the abbey's other cloister, long beds of physic plants bordered by boards and pebbles, laid out in rectangles like chapters: sage, fennel, dill, rue, betony, hyssop, each with a small wooden tally. Some days he sends the strapping novices to fetch, and some days he goes himself, stooping with a basket at first light, the hem of his habit darkened by dew. The ache has its own arguments, but the house has rules for pain as it has rules for bread. The rule forbids meat to the healthy, but the ailing take broth richer than the refectory's weekday pottage, and sometimes the infirmer grants a pittance: an egg, a cup of sweetened wine, a handful of almonds ground in milk. Toothache qualifies you for small mercies: softer bread, warm spiced drink, a place near the fire in the calefactory after prime to keep the jaw from stiffening. He writes your name and a short note: dole for dental pain. In the ledger, a book as heavy as any psalter. He examines you without ceremony. A spoon handle wraps each tooth lightly. You flinch at the molar that wakes like a struck hive. He presses gingerly under the angle of the jaw and notes the heat there. With a cloth he dries your gums and peers at the swell, lifting the lip with the back of the spoon. He asks if you have slept. You answer that the hours slipped in fragments between the antiphons. He nods. He is not a physician with a university seal, nor a city surgeon with a shining instrument roll. He is a monk with a cabinet and a memory for what has helped other mouths in this long room. He begins with what is kindest: a rinse of wine steeped with sage and a pinch of salt to draw and sweeten, a dab of clove-scented oil if the cupboard permits, dear, used like a blessing. If the gum shows a point of ripeness, he waits until the warmth softens it more, then uses a small, keen lancet to open a way for what should leave. It is done with care, a cloth ready, a prayer said under the breath that is not for spectacle. Relief, when it comes, is not trumpeture. It is a steadying of the pulse and an easier swallow. He is willing to wait, to return in an hour with more warmth, to try again at sext when the sun has given its consent. If the tooth itself is the enemy and not just the swelling, the infirmary considers the town. Some houses keep a visiting barber surgeon for such business, allowing him in on fair weeks with oversight. Others train their own hands for mild surgery. Your house keeps to the middle way. The infirmary will lance, wash, pack, and soothe, but for the lever and the pelican he will send to the gatehouse and have a lay brother fetch a man from the market by agreement. Prayer orders the day, but pain arranges exceptions. The sick dine when the bell says eat, not when the strict table calls. He will add your name to the little list that goes with the message: tooth to be drawn, lower molar left after none. Between visits he tends the small economies that make the hall smooth. He directs the novice to boil more linen. He measures alum with a knife tip and mixes it with wine in a shallow dish, marking the proportions with a mnemonic that is half psalm, half pantry verse. He checks the brazier and invites you to sit nearer. He instructs another brother with a sore mouth to make a soft poultice of bread and milk, to be held against the cheek and renewed while it cools. He warns one who gnashes his teeth at night to bind a small cloth between molars. Not dignified, he admits, but quieter than splintered enamel. The abbey day continues its round. From the church comes the thin river of chant, carrying through stone. You catch phrases about mercy and measure. The infirmary hums the tale of a psalm while he binds your head with a warmer cloth. He pauses to read from a small compilation of remedies copied years ago, its margins crowded by notes in several hands. The names in the book are a lineage. Isidore's thought about the nature of tooth. A gloss that mentions a Greek who wrote of gum heat. A note in a cramped script about a Moorish physician and wires for jawbone. A woman's name, Hildegard, in the side margin with a simple counsel. Keep the head warm when the jaw suffers. Favor herbs that warm without burning. The book is part pharmacy and part memory palace. Mid-morning, he crosses the cloister to the garden. You picture the beds as he moves. Betony, useful and much praised, cut into small bundles and hung under the eaves. Plantain leaves broad as hands, useful to cool and knit. Fennel tall and feathery, its seed chewed by the brothers after fish to sweeten the breath. He gathers sage sprigs and a handful of mint. He takes a pinch of rue and then thinks better of it, rue being strong medicine with a stern reputation, and returns it to the soil with an apology only the leaves can hear. He plucks a single head of yarrow, more for bleeding wounds than mouths, but he likes to have some near. When he returns, he makes a simple infusion, crushes the leaves with the pestle, and warms the bowl over the brazier until the liquid draws fragrance. He instructs you to rinse and spit until the basin shows less cloud. He packs your gum with clean lint and a touch of wine. He does not promise that the barber will be gentle. He promises that the job will be done with witnesses and a steady room. You doze briefly in the warmth. A novice pads in with a loaf more finely sieved than the refectory, free of the bran that lodges like gravel between teeth. He leaves it and returns with a cup of thin ale. The infirmary marks his ledger again. Soft bread for aching mouth, 3 days. In the margin, a tidy symbol marks dental matters, a tiny square with a dot, his own shorthand among many. From the cloister walk, the prior looks in. He asks if the hall is quiet, if the barber has been sent for, if the stocks of sage are enough until Michaelmas. The infirmary answers in the order asked. He requests permission to purchase cloves when the next trader calls, reminding the prior that last year's allotment spared several brothers a rough morning. The prior nods and leaves a coin from the almonry purse on the table, a practical mercy to match the theological one sung in choir. None approaches. The sun lifts a finger's breadth higher in the oculus, tracing a coin of light across the infirmarier's chest as he leans close to check your gum again. He presses lightly and judges by your flinch that the lancet has done good work. Swelling is softer, the path open. He decides to wait an hour more before calling for iron from the town, to see if the tide will go out on its own with heat and washing and patience. He is comfortable with waiting. The rule taught him that time cures as many things as it complicates. Outside the wall, the market hums. Inside the hall, the rope of routine holds. In a house founded for prayer, where silence is a kind of nourishment, how does the man with keys and herbs decide when quiet care is sufficient, and when to admit the hot iron and the pelican from the noisy world beyond the gate? By none, the bell's third slow note drifts through the cloister like a wooden oar in still water. The infirmary has decided to send, but he waits the full hour as promised, not because delay is a virtue, but because heat and rinsing have softened the swelling and drained some fury. You sit near the brazier, jaw wrapped, listening to the lick of flame on charcoal and the soft arithmetic of footsteps passing the door. The novices return with fresh linens. The ledger is left open to today's leaf, your name traced in brown ink beside the small square mark that means mouth. At the gatehouse, a lay brother admits the barber on condition. No loud display, no promises of marvels, no coin taken in the hall itself. The abbey keeps decorum even for pain. The man arrives carrying a satchel and a case that clicks softly when he sets it down. He bows, not theatrically, and says little. His hands are clean in the way of men who wash with the same care each day rather than by rule. His sleeves are pushed to the forearm, revealing a pale line where sun never reaches. The infirmary greets him by name and places a stool by the window, just as in town, but here the window frames a square of garden instead of a lane. The case opens on familiar iron, a pelican with a smooth bolster, an elevator for roots, a slender hook, a probe, a file, and a short cautery iron with a flat nose like a tiny spatula. The barber inspects your gum, presses with a clean rag, and nods to the infirmary. The monk describes what has been done. Sage rinses, lancing at lauds, warm cloths, alum, and wine. The barber approves in a few words. He would rather take up iron after good preparation than push through angry flesh. For numbness, there is only the old arithmetic, courage, breath, and the simple clouding of wine. The infirmary measures a small cup, sweetened with a touch of honey to soften the bite. He does not seek to drown your wits. He seeks to loosen your jaw without abandoning prudence. A novice brings a narrow rope looped into a knot, not for binding, simply for holding. The barber wraps a folded cloth across your opposite molars to keep the mouth open and the tongue safe. He chooses the pelican and tests its beak against the rim of the troubled tooth. The earlier lance has relieved pressure. Now the question is whether the tooth can be persuaded whole. The infirmary places a hand on your shoulder, steady, not restraining. In this room, every touch is practical. The barber sets the bolster low against the gum, finds his angle, and pauses. You hear birds in the garden and the faint scrape of sandals in the cloister, the world proceeding while your mouth waits to be altered. The first motion is not violent. He rocks gently, a coaxing that asks fibers to remember how to let go. You breathe toward your belly as the infirmary has taught a dozen feverish chests to do when air is stingy. The ache swells to pressure, pressure to bright insistence. Then, like a taut knot that finally slides, something yields. The barber adjusts, turns a breath's width, and lifts. The tooth comes not with a snap but with a tired sigh, long held and now released. The barber inspects it. Both roots present, curving like the prongs of a wishbone. He says good, and does not force cheer beyond that. There is bleeding, steady but not wild. The infirmary has lint ready, pressed with wine and a pinch of alum. He tamps the socket and holds your jaw closed with a firm palm for a slow count. He inspects again, and for a moment, here is where the day could turn. The sight wells more than he likes. He nods to the barber, who sets the cautery iron in the brazier until its face glows a dull herb gold. The smell is iron and heat, not fire's bright edge. The infirmary murmurs a psalm fragment not as charm, but as measure, its cadence the length of the task. When the iron touches, the pain is sharp and brief, a line drawn and finished. The bleeding stills the way a quarrel sometimes does when a firm voice intervenes. The smell is not pleasant. The room remains quiet. The barber wipes the iron, returns it to cooling coals, and tells you to bite gently on the clean lint while he prepares a final pack with myrrh and wine. The infirmary adds a drop of clove oil to the cloth. Here expense is mercy. After, the barber examines the tooth again for any fractured tip. Satisfied, he sets it on the cloth, invites you to see it if you wish, and then lets the infirmary decide its fate. The monk keeps a small jar where such pieces are stored a day, then disposed beyond the wall with other things the rule prefers not to keep close. In some places, people cherish the pulled tooth as proof of trial endured. Here, simplicity is safer than stories. The barber washes his instruments in warmed wine, then dries them with care. He oils each lightly. Iron endures better when honored, and returns them to their place. He writes nothing. The infirmary writes enough for both. Payment will be handled at the gate by a lay brother, the fee modest by prior agreement, and sometimes forgiven when the caller is a poor man taken from field work. The abbey's charity is not theatrical either. You are sat up slowly. The infirmary brings a cup of cool water for your hands first, then for a rinse. He instructs you to keep your head raised tonight, to avoid the hearth's direct heat, to take broth at vespers and soft bread only on the right side. He tells a novice to bring you a cloth in case bleeding whispers back at Compline. He marks your name for a night lamp, a small flame set near your bed so the infirmary can see quickly if your color changes, if fever climbs, if pain grows sharp in the throat. The long hall has learned the signs that call a man from early sleep. In the garden, the evening air thickens with the green smell of sage and damp earth. The barber takes his leave without flourish. He has done only what he always does, but the room feels altered, not relieved so much as steadied, threaded together by a chain of small decisions that kept the day from going astray. The novices whisper about the smell of the iron. The infirmary shrugs. One instant of heat has saved a long night of worry. At Vespers, the choir hums a plain chant that repeats the word misericordia with a slow, rocking cadence. You do not sing, but the syllables pass through the stone into your bones anyway. The infirmary checks your dressing once more, changes the pack, and draws a thin line of charcoal on the ledger beside your name. That symbol means iron used, a private note for future caution. The hall quiets. The novices gather bowls, broth the color of old brass, bread pared soft, a spoonful of almond milk sweetened from the pantry. You take the spoon with your left hand so you can rest your right fingers against your bandage. Sleep comes in brief fairy rides, interrupted by the small wakings of a body testing new edges. The infirmary keeps watch, his chair angled toward both door and brazier, a man accustomed to nights that ask for company more than conversation. He warms his palms near the coals and looks at the little chest, jars, linen, iron, an order that has taken years to learn. He thinks of the rules chapter on the sick, which tells him they are to be served as Christ, with all consideration. He thinks of coins left by the prior for cloves. He thinks of the barber's quiet nod at the window. Between Vespers and Compline, the night decides its character. Will the socket hold its peace, or will heat lift along the jaw and pull breath tight? Will the morning bring you back to broth and quiet, or to fever's bright wheel? Compline folds over the house like a plain blanket. The hall dims to lamp glow, shadows braided with the smell of warm linen and wine. You lie half upright, jaw bound, a wad of clean lint resting where the tooth once kept its post. The infirmary moves in small arcs, a keeper of tides. He feels your pulse at the wrist, counts while the psalm's last syllables sink into the stone, and writes a narrow note beside your name. Color good, breath easy, little heat. Between beds, he adjusts wicks so that the light is low enough to invite sleep, and high enough to show a change should one try to hide. The night finds its tempo, short wakings, longer floats. A novice pads in hourly with a lamp, checks the cloth, trades the warm for the cooling, whispers the same question each time, pain, as if the word itself could be made smaller. Once near midnight, the socket weeps a little more than before. The infirmary draws the cloth away with 2 fingers, examines without haste, and replaces it with a fresh pack, wine, a touch of alum, a breath of clove. He will not call the iron again unless he must. He tells you to sip a spoon of almond milk, to keep the throat easy. You taste nut and faint sweetness and the clean echo of the wine, and it steadies you like a hand on a stair. Around the second watch, a different sleeper calls softly, jaw stiff, tongue heavy. The infirmary listens, lays a palm against the man's neck, judges that this is not your trouble visited again but another's old coil tightening. He mixes a poultice of bread and warm milk, tucks it against the cheek, and murmurs the small instructions that make up a craft. Rinse at lauds, hold warmth, keep the head high. You drift and surface and drift. Through the shutters, the abbey's slow heart keeps time. A bell, a corridor footfall, the shiver of rushes under sandals. Care here is mostly counting and cleaning, punctuated by iron only when arithmetic fails. At what the brothers call the cock's first thought, the infirmary brings a bowl of tepid sage infusion and a smaller cup of salted wine. You rinse, spit, rinse again until the liquid in the basin goes from clouded to pale. He peels the bandage, checks the margins of the socket for angry color, nods. He loosens the binding and reties it, a shade softer. He notes that you speak easily, that swallowing does not lift the brow. The ledger receives these small victories in a script so tidy it looks like patience made visible. Lauds arrives cold and clear. In the garden, dew beads along the edges of plant and leaves like a string of dull pearls. The infirmary walks there, not for need but for measure. He takes 2 sprigs of mint and pinches a sage leaf between finger and thumb until oil glosses the skin. He lets the scent remind him that a room is made tolerable as much by simple comforts as by decisive acts. Back inside, he has a novice air the linens, sweep the rushes, set a clean jug by your bed. He asks after your sleep. You answer that the night had more ordinary minutes than you expected, an old monastic compliment. When prime sounds, he permits you broth and soft bread again, with a small bowl of pottage thinned to a drink. He advises against hot ovens and hard crusts for 3 days, against sharp spices for 2. He gives the other jaw the work of the morning, saving the left for softness and breath. He shows you how to press the cheek lightly with a warm cloth if a dull ache returns, and how to change the pack without prying at the wound. Twist, set, compress, count to the end of a short antiphon. He warns that sometimes on the 3rd day the emptiness complains anew. If so, bring the basin cloud to him to see. He does not use the phrase others will, centuries hence, for that returning ache. He simply calls it a socket that wants attention, and he attends. When the barber returns to the gate at Tierce to ask after the night, the abbey keeps its promises to itself as well as to guests. The infirmary answers with a brief nod and the word quiet. Of the iron he says only that it earned its keep. He asks the gatekeeper to see the man paid from the almonry purse as agreed. The barber leaves with the same lack of flourish with which he arrived. Profession here is measured by absence of stories. Midday brings small chores disguised as rest. You are asked to sit near the cloister walk where the sun warms the stone. The infirmary likes healing to feel the day's weather. He shows you a toothpick of carved boxwood kept in a clean pouch. The brothers use them after the refectory meal, one of those quiet habits that keep the mouth from turning troublesome. He speaks of bread, why the bakehouse is careful to sift fine on abbey days, why the lay servants are reminded to keep the millstones true. He admits that grit rides into every mouth regardless, that labor wears enamel like river wears rock, that no house can banish ache, only temper it. He says all this without philosophy. It is inventory spoken aloud. By nones, your color is still good, and the packing shows no foulness. The infirmary changes it one last time, substituting a faint smear of honey on the lint with the wine, more for sweetness and moisture than for any other property, although he has noticed that wounds under honey often prefer to behave. He gives you leave to sleep 2 hours after sunset and not to rise for nocturnes. He closes the ledger line with a small mark, a circle with a stroke, his sign for mended with watchfulness. In the margin he copies a single word from a text he keeps returning to, mansuetudo, gentleness, not as disposition only, but as method. You walk the cloister slowly. The choir is practicing a psalm with a long, rocking line. The infirmary door stands ajar, smelling of wine and linen and herb. The novice boils cloths and tongs them out to steam. Somewhere a brother recites Hildegard's counsel about warming herbs without scorching them. Somewhere a lay brother trims a quill for toothpicks, a small mercy counted by the dozen. In this place, relief is the sum of quiet repetitions learned by heart. By the next dawn your jaw knows the new shape of itself. You chew carefully on the right, sip without thinking, breathe without flinch. The infirmary dismisses you with instructions folded into the morning. Rinse after meals this week. Keep the head covered when the cold wind rises. Return if the 3rd day complains. Avoid boasts about being cured. He looks toward the beds beyond you. The business of the hall continues. A man with a cracked molar from a stony crust, a novice with sore gums from winter cold, an old brother whose teeth are more memory than tool. The infirmary will not run out of arithmetic. You step into the pale cloister light, jaw easier, thoughts slower. The bell calls another hour. The barber's iron, the monk's ledger, the garden's leaves, the rules chapter, all of it has joined for a simple end. To let you eat, sing, and sleep without the jaw's bright tyranny. In cities far from these walls, people trade coin for the same permission. In centuries ahead, needles and bright machines will grant it faster and with less smoke. Yet the pattern remains. Rinse, warm, wait, decide, act with measure, watch the night, write it down. When care is stripped of spectacle and set to the metronome of hours, how much of healing is simply the courage to do small things well, and who keeps that courage for us when our mouths, or our days, will not. Story 3. Al-Zarawa's Shadow in Toledo, Instruments Across Faiths. You come to Toledo at noon, when the sun whitens stone and wind combs dust along the Zocodover. The city sounds like work being counted. Mule hooves on flags, shutters unlatching, a pestle thudding almonds into milk. You are here because one molar has made itself the lord of your hours, and because this is the place where words are hammered into tools and tools return those hours to you. Up a stair above a cutler's stall, three men lean over a long table. One reads Arabic from a neat Maghrebi hand. A Jewish grammarian murmurs the sense into the street's romance. A clerk from Cremona pins it into Latin that physicians and barbers can keep. Their manuscript is the 30th book of Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi's Kitab al-Letter 1E63 Macron F, the surgery volume that Latin mouths call Albucases. They copy not only sentences but shapes, beak-like forceps, slim elevators, hooks for fractured roots, files, cautery irons with noses no bigger than a fingernail. The drawings are instruments made of ink, waiting to become iron. You listen while the Latin clerk turns a paragraph into instructions a jaw can understand. If a tooth is firm, avoid violence. If it yields, rotate the instrument gently to loosen the fibrous bond, then lift with restraint. Do not set iron against bone. Scrape away tartar before any drawing lest the beak slip. When bleeding follows, begin with pressure and lint. If it will not obey, touch briefly with a heated iron. Cleanse with warm wine. Pack with soft wool or linen. Keep watch through the night. These are not promises, only sequences that other hands have tested and made modest. You carry that sequence down to the smith who forges its shapes. His workshop is narrow, shaded, and hot, the anvil bright with habit. He tempers steel for church hinges and soldiers' buckles, and for the quieter tools that visit mouths. He judges heat by color, straw bronze, the first blue, and quenches at the line he has learned to trust. When he files the inner faces of a beak, he tests their meeting edge as carefully as a scribe tests a margin. He pads the pelican-like bolster with linen dipped in gum so pressure spreads instead of bites. He says teeth are small doors, some stuck by pride, some by fear, some by honest architecture. The right lever opens the right one. In the next lane, apothecaries sell the rest of the business. Myrrh and alum for packs, sage and mint for rinses, clove oil dear as rumor, vinegar in glazed jugs, wine in skins. A Jewish physician shows you a calculus scraper with a swan neck bend and insists you lift tartar away before any beak dares the root. He quotes Albucases on wiring a loose incisor to its sturdier neighbor with soft metal, on splinting a fractured jaw with bands and a diet of thin pottage until the bone remembers itself, on respecting the nerve that runs near the lip, because a fool's pressure buys a numb mouth and an angry customer. He shrugs when you ask which creed owns these tools. Pain has no sect, he says, neither should its remedies. By late day you sit in a small room where a barber who reads Latin keeps his chair. The basin is plain tin, the brazier hums. A leaf from Albucases is pinned to a beam with a thorn. He taps your teeth with the back of a spoon, watches the flinch, and chooses patience. He lances the gum where heat has gathered and washes with wine until the basin clears, then sets a pack of lint and myrrh. He tells you that driving a beak into an angry mouth invites splinters and fever. He would rather soften the ground and come back when the jaw itself is ready to let go. You study his instruments while he speaks to an apprentice about angles. 3 elevators, one flat as a tiny chisel, one rounded like a coin's edge, one curving for narrow roots. Beaks of different bends for incisors and molars. A short cautery iron with a flattened face, kept near the coals for the moment when pressure is not enough. He has learned the position of the mental nerve by error and by fear. He points to the place and tells the boy, press low and the lip will tingle and curse you. Turn, do not wrench, he says, and the apprentice oils the iron until it drinks its share. Night lays a blue line across the rooftops. You sleep above a scribe's shop, waking to rinse until the water in your bowl runs pale. Through the shutter you hear the last hammer at the tanner's and a priest's sandal on the stair. The truce that keeps 3 faiths talking in the same market holds through darkness for the same reason it holds by day. The work is easier that way. Pain is ecumenical, so is relief. At first light you climb again to the translator's room. They are arguing gently about a word for a cautery face. The clerk wants spatula. The grammarian says lingula, a tongue. The Muslim reader smiles and says the Arabic means simply a small, flat nose, and any craftsman will know which iron to heat. Downstairs, the smith shrugs. He has 3 such faces in his drawer, and the mouth will tell him which to choose. In Toledo, the loop runs from book to iron to hand and back again, each correcting the others without ceremony. After prime, the barber checks you. The swelling has eased. The tooth now yields a little to the elevator's persuasion. He stops at once, pleased with a small victory. Enough for today, he says, so the root will come whole tomorrow. He instructs you to keep to soft bread and warm broth, to avoid the oven's mouth, to rinse after each swallow, to sleep propped. He adds a breath of clove near the pack, not to banish pain, but to blur it into the edges until morning. You spend the afternoon watching the quiet commerce of mouths. A goldsmith steadies a loose tooth by lashing it to its neighbor with a silk thread and a strand of soft wire. A scribe traces an instrument plate, copying each hook with a careful nail so the smith will not misread a curve. An apothecary grinds alum with wine and speaks of prices in 3 currencies as easily as of remedies. None of it is heroic. All of it is how dinner happens, and song, and the bargaining that holds streets together. Dusk returns you to the chair. The barber warms water, lifts the pack, and tests the tooth with the smallest elevator. It turns a fraction as if reconsidering its allegiance. He stops, satisfied. He sets fresh lint, notes a mark in his ledger, and sends you away with a blessing shaped like a list. Warmth, rinses, rest, quiet food, return at tears. In a city that teaches strangers to share nouns and measures, what will tomorrow ask from the book upstairs, from the iron downstairs, and from the small courage behind your teeth? Tierce lifts a pale square of light onto the barber's table. You arrive with your jaw less swollen, a cloth tucked modestly at your collar. The room smells of warm wine and iron that has learned heat so well it carries a faint memory of it even cold. The leaf from Albucases remains pinned to the beam, inked hooks and beaks hovering like patient birds. The barber begins not with iron, but with words he has made into habit. He asks when the ache woke in the night, whether the pack bled after midnight, whether swallowing stung. You answer, and he nods as if ticking entries in a ledger only he can see. He lifts the lint, rinses the socket with wine from a piped goose quill, and dries the gum with wool teased fine between fingers. Preparation is a craft of small faiths. He taps the suspect molar with the back of a spoon, less protest than yesterday. He takes the slimmest elevator, the one with a coin-round tip, and presses not up but sideways into the sulcus, a whisper of pressure that unknots fibers rather than tests the crown. Turn, don't wrench, he reminds the apprentice, who repeats the phrase softly, the way choir boys learn neumes. You see the sequence you heard upstairs folded into motion. Clean first. He skims a calculus scraper under the gum line and spoons away gritty tartar that would make the beak skate. Loosen next. Short rotations, a rest, then the same again. He waits more than he moves. The apprentice oils the pelican's pivot with a breath of walnut, then polishes its bolster with a strip of linen until it slides over gum like a thumb. Nothing in this room rushes, yet the morning advances. A messenger arrives with a pinch of clove, dear as rumor, purchased from a Genoese who swears by Alexandria and Calicut in the same sentence. A drop is married to wine, and a cloth is briefly wet with it. The barber paints your gum with the scented edge, not to banish pain but to dull its appetite. He sets the pelican, tests the beak's purchase below the crown, and here is where the book, the iron, and the hand must agree, decides whether the day is ready. He pauses and looks through the window at the alley sun, as if counting to 10 along the wall. Then he begins the slow lever that is the signature of his craft. The bolster presses the gum, the beak gathers the tooth, pressure mounts, the elevator waits. He rocks the instrument in small arcs, trading brute force for patient geometry. The tooth answers like an old hinge remembering the shape of open. Your hand tightens on the chair's arm, your other hand relaxes, surprised by its own trust. The first rise fails and is allowed to fail. He stops at once and puts the pelican down so gently it is a lesson by itself. He returns to the elevator, slides it between root and socket and coaxes again. He explains, for the apprentice as much as for you, that roots often split into two prongs that curl back. If the first motion suggests entanglement, the wiser path is to unwind a few fibers more before asking for release. He does not say periodontal ligament. He says the little threads, and the apprentice understands. He tests once more. This time the motion has the quiet inevitability of water carving a channel it has used before. The tooth lifts a finger's breadth and then, obedient at last, completes its leaving. There is no flourish. The barber inspects the root tips, curved like a wishbone and intact. He shows you briefly, proof that the hidden part did not remain hidden. The apprentice learns as much from this intact root as from any lecture upstairs. Bleeding follows the rules of cloth and pressure. The barber tamps lint soaked in wine and pressed with a dust of alum. He holds your jaw shut with his palm the length of a slow psalm verse. When he removes the pack, the welling is smaller. He nods, satisfied, and sets a final pad with myrrh, the bitterness that sweetens breath after violence. The cautery iron rests untouched today. The brazier is only a kitchen fire again. While you sit, he turns to a goldsmith who has brought a different problem, a front tooth loosened by a fall on the cathedral steps. The book upstairs has a plate for this. The barber and the smith confer, set a silk thread around the wobbling incisor and draw a strand of soft metal, a tame, bright filament, around the two neighboring teeth, tying the trio into a temporary fellowship. The patient will drink pottage and keep his mouth gentle for a fortnight. If he obeys, the tooth will remember its house. You watch the wire catch a beam of light, and think of how often survival is simply patience braided with caution. At midday you walk back to Translators Street. The men at the table argue amiably about a verb that might mean scrape or plane. The clerk proposes radier. The grammarian offers scalpro deterror. The reader shrugs. Any word that keeps the beak from slipping is the right one. In the corner, a boy copies the instrument plates onto thin parchment for the smiths who cannot climb the stair. He traces each curve with a stylus before committing ink, to learn the hook before leaving the scratch. On a quiet winter night far from Toledo, you sip warm water after a meal and feel the well-mannered absence where a tooth used to be. The relief is ordinary and therefore enormous. You think of the three men under the lamp, the smith's colors, the apothecary's chalked pestle, the barber's hand holding your jaw to the length of a psalm. You think of how scholarship, craft, and patience found each other in a market and agreed without oath to be humble in the service of supper. In centuries ahead, Novocaine will lower voices, the chair will recline, and a light will bloom from a metal arm like a small moon. Yet even then the good work will depend on the same sentences pinned to the beam. Clean first, loosen, turn, don't wrench, touch briefly, wait more than you move. You close your eyes and the city returns. The lamp, the page, the iron, the hand, each in the right place, as if the world could be persuaded to heal by being translated carefully into itself. If the most durable treaties are the ones written in habits rather than ink, which habits in your own century carry the weight of those three small words over the beam? Turn, don't wrench. And what would change if more of our remedies, for bodies and for towns, obeyed them? Story 4. The Champagne Fair drawer, ropes, drums, and open-air surgery. You step into the fair at Troyes the way a fish enters a weir, drawn by current and narrowed by stakes. Timber booths make lanes where there were none yesterday. Cloth bellies in the wind, bells argue with hawkers, and the ground carries a patchwork of straw meant to keep mud from claiming shoes. The counts of Champagne have granted safe conduct. Tollmen raise poles. Seals hang from cords on the chest of a sergeant who counts carts and quarrels. The fair has its own law while it lasts. Disputes to be settled at the Peapowder Court under a canvas awning. Weights checked at a bench where lead seals press certainty into small trade. Within this order, noise. You anchor yourself by the smell of vinegar and hot iron, a brazier tucked beneath a painted board that shows a large white tooth between two cheerful pincers. The man beneath it wears a red coat that remembers several owners and a hat as bright as a market apple. He keeps a drum strap across his shoulder and a rope tied to a post. He is a tooth drawer, a mountebank if you mistrust him, a traveling surgeon if you offer charity. He has a small chest for potions and a roll of instruments, a pelican with its padded bolster, a pair of blunt beaks, a slender hook, a short elevator, a probe, a file worn thin from teeth that complained about edges. A coil of boiled linen lies near the brazier. A bottle of wine sits within easy reach and is used for everything: courage, washing, bargain. You do not sit yet. You watch. Spectacle is a tool here. A boy beats the drum in a rattle that makes a circle around the chair. The tooth drawer announces remedies with the confidence of a ship's bell: a tincture for foul breath, a powder for bleeding gums, an oil that puts the worm to sleep. He points at the painted tooth and promises either a kiss or a tug. The crowd laughs at having such simple options. He tells a man in the front to hold the rope and show how strong he is. He tells a woman that a ribbon tied to the wrist will keep sickness from rising to the jaw. He is selling calm as much as cure. In the city you left behind, the barber's shop had beams to duck and a warden's parchment on the wall. Here, license is a voice that does not shake and a hand that does not flinch when watched. Some drawers carry letters, pages that say they have served under a surgeon in a garrison or apprenticed in a town. But paper on a windy day is not as persuasive as a tooth lifted whole. You know enough to count successes before offering your mouth. The first patient is a carter who has run out of sleep. He sits on a low stool with a back plank that someone has planed smooth for gripping. The rope is put into his hands. No trick, simply something to give strength a path. The drawer's apprentice wraps a rag across the opposite molars to guard the tongue. He tips wine into the carter's mouth and catches the spill in a basin cut from a barrel stave. The pelican is set and tested and then set again, patience disguised as flourish. The lever does what good levers do, trades small motion for steady pressure until the tooth remembers it can leave. The carter goes pale and then relieved. The beaked iron raises a prize, 2 roots like a wishbone. The crowd shouts. A woman crosses herself. The boy shakes the drum in triumph and then in salesmanship. You edge closer and mark the details that decide outcomes. The bolster is visibly padded, linen over wood so the gum is pressed, not torn. The beak goes under the crown, not at its middle. The drawer rocks before he lifts. He cleans the mouth with cloth and wine after, not merely before. He packs the socket with lint, and this you note with quiet gratitude. He does not reach for cautery iron unless blood asks for it. He satisfies first with pressure and alum from a small packet knocked into the wine like chalk. He admires his work only long enough to show the owner that the roots came whole. He does not fling the tooth for show. He drops it into a bowl behind the stool where it will not step into legend. Around you, the fare behaves like a stomach. Bread is sold in wheels the size of a shoulder. Eels are kept in tubs that smell like river and hope. A man sells toothpicks carved from boxwood by the dozen, wrapped in parchment cones with a drawing of St. Apollonia holding her pliers. The apothecary's bench offers sage bundled with thread, mint tied like a broom, and a small bottle of oil that swears it is clove. The price of cloves trembles with caravan gossip. Today it is a promise kept only in drops. Sweetmeats appear at a Lombard stall, and with them the future ache of those who can afford the taste. Sugar rises like a white tower under cloth. It breaks with a tap and dissolves into carries more efficiently than any sermon. The fare teaches appetites and then rents you a remedy. Not all drawers deserve a mouth. You see one at the edge of the cattle lane using a naked stick of iron with a notch filed into it, levering against gum as if wood had no memory. His assistant holds a horn to the patient's lips and tells him to drink faster. He uses his own shoulder as bolster and twists without cleaning. The tooth snaps. The crowd murmurs for the wrong reason. He reaches for a hook, digs, and produces a root like a barb. He flourishes it to win back dignity and loses it to the wind. He packs the mouth with a rag that was not clean when morning started. You walk away from this man, and you keep that lesson for any day that asks you to choose between loud and careful. At the good chair, The drawer speaks between tasks about places he has set his rope: Provence, Lagny, Barcerob. He mentions the Peapodder court more than once, small disputes about payment, a merchant who accused him of fraud when swelling returned, a case settled by inspecting a tooth that he had saved in a jar against such arguments. Fairs have their temporary courts because money moves faster than memory. Teeth serve as witnesses when people's stories diverge. He keeps a tiny ledger that lists towns and numbers, and whether iron spoke or cloth sufficed. He says it keeps his head straight when boasting threatens to borrow his mouth. You watch him manage hazard when a molar's crown shears at the gum. He stops. He warms a slender hook, not to burn but to drive damp away, and then dries it and sets it with care along the root's shoulder. He uses short patience and then longer patience. He says nothing while his hands do the telling. When at last the root turns and lifts, he shows it to the apprentice as if it were a small, plain coin that proves the weight of his earlier promise. The drum does not rattle for this one. The drawer's nod is enough. Between customers, he counsels the crowd with the dull advice that keeps mouths quiet. Rinse with warm wine and sage after you eat. Do not bite hard bread on the wounded side for a week. Keep the head warmed at night. Do not boast that you are healed on the first day. If heat rises along the jaw, come back before the sun is down. He says this every time as if it were a charm, though it is only a list. A woman asks about the worm. He dips a splinter of tartar in wine and sets it wriggling on a plate, an old trick. Then he shrugs and says worms or no worms. Tartar lifts and pain leaves when handled with a steady lever. He will not let superstition have the last word, but he does not quarrel with it in public either. He has learned that saving a mouth argues better than laughing at a belief. Even spectacle obeys small rules. He hangs a strip of clean cloth in the sun after each drawing and lays used rags in a pail lidded with a board, not for science, but because dogs and flies can undo an afternoon's work faster than rumor. He wipes iron with oil against the damp under canvas. He keeps the brazier's heat low unless called. He asks for coin after the basin is emptied, not before. He reserves a place by the chair for the old and the young, and he refuses some mouths politely. Not today, heat too high. Go rinse and walk and return after nones. By late day, your jaw has decided its own verdict. The ache that brought you to the fair sits in its corner like a stubborn tenant who knows an eviction notice is near. You finger the coin in your pouch and study the rope, the drum, the beak of iron polished by other fears. The good drawer glances up and sees the question on your face. He turns the pelican over in his hands as if testing whether the wood still remembers its restraint. He nods to the stool. The crowd shifts to make room for the next story. In a place where law is brief and noise is long, how do you choose the chair that will leave you with a mouth you can use tomorrow? And what price do you pay, beyond coin, for trusting a cure that calls the drum before it calls your name? By nones the fair has learned its afternoon stride. Sun sits heavier on canvas, vinegar smells brighter, drums slow to a heartbeat meant to gather rather than dazzle. You stand at the edge of the ring where the good drawer keeps order with a rope, a basin, and a tone of voice that treats strangers like neighbors. The stool is wiped again, wine and a square of linen rubbed until the grain of the wood rises clean. The apprentice folds fresh cloths into a neat tower and sets alum in a small horn cup, measured by pinch not by pride. Before you sit, the drawer tells you plainly what his work costs. A base fee for drawing a simple tooth, a little more if roots splinter, no charge for counsel alone, nothing today if he refuses the case. If iron must speak to bleeding, he will not add coin. He says the cautery pays him back in reputation, which is a currency stronger than any minted at Troyes. You nod. He nods. The drum says nothing. The fair, for all its noise, respects a bargain stated in a small voice. He examines as a city barber would, with a spoon's handle and an eye that reads flinches more fluently than words. He presses along the gum and under the jaw angle. He notes heat with the back of his knuckle. He lifts the lip and checks for swelling that points. He asks you to rinse, to spit, to open, to breathe through the nose. His talk is brief and procedural. Warm wine, cloth, rope, breath, turn, not wrench, pack, rest. He explains to the crowd as much as to you, because spectacle here is also instruction. It teaches what a careful drawing looks like, so the rash are marked without his having to shout their names. The pelican comes forward, its bolster showing the tidy repair the apprentice made at Tierce. Fresh linen glued and trimmed so pressure will spread like a palm instead of bite like a thumbnail. The beak is tested under the crown, then withdrawn. He cleans first, lifting tartar with a curved scraper and polishing the gum where the beak will sit. A small pinch of clove warms in wine. A cloth tastes faintly of it and touches the sore place once. You grip the rope, not for restraint but for aim. He wraps a folded cloth over the opposite molars to guard tongue and cheek. The apprentice sets the basin where it will not tip to theatrics. He rocks before he lifts. The motion is a patient geometry, short arcs that ask the fibers to unknot where they cling. The crowd leans because crowds do. Your eyes fix on a brass tack in the stool's edge and learn its story by heart, while the lever speaks its language into your jaw. Pressure rises like weather and then changes, not breaking, just moving. He stops at the first resistance that feels wrong, because haste is the tax fool merchants pay at the peepouter bench, and in this trade the interest compounds. He returns to the elevator, coaxes, sighs through his nose, and waits the length of 2 fist pulses. Then the lever again, a breath's width changed. The tooth yields in a small, obedient arc. The apprentice's shoulders drop, yours follow. Bleeding is not a surprise, so no one treats it like one. He packs the socket with lint soaked in wine and dusted with alum, closes your jaw with his palm for the length of a psalm fragment, and watches the cloth drink. The crowd murmurs approval not at the blood but at his refusal to rush toward the iron. When he lifts the pack, the welling is modest. The cautery can remain a rumor. He sets a new pack with a breath of myrrh and shows you the tooth only briefly, both roots intact, curved like a wishbone, reassurance in bone rather than promise in air. He does not fling it skyward, because wind owns too many stories already. A woman with a scarf tight over her chin steps forward with a front tooth that wobbles in the wake of a winter fall. The drawer will not draw it. He suggests steadiness instead. He bands it to its neighbor with a silk thread and a thin strip of soft metal cut from a bit a goldsmith traded for ointment last year. He instructs her to keep to pottage and to hold her tongue quiet for a fortnight. He tells the crowd that not all victories are removals. The drum remains silent for this one too. The fair learns a different kind of cheer. Not far from the ring, a sergeant of the fair, seal on a thong, cudgel at belt, walks his circuit. He stops to check weights at a stall where toothpicks are sold by the dozen and reminds the vendor that the lead stamp on the balance must be visible. He glances at the drawer's pail. The lid is on. Flies are denied. Dogs sniff elsewhere. The sergeant nods and moves on. At the peepouter bench under a patched awning, 2 men bicker over a fee. A drawer of the loud kind broke a tooth and a promise. The bench hears both, inspects a brown jar produced like evidence, counts coins, and writes a brief order with a chalk that squeaks like a small mouse. The court is called Dusty Feet because merchants come to it straight from the lane. Its judgments are the size of the day and are remembered because they keep the day going. You sit and count breaths while the pack settles. The drawer's advice is dull because dull is what works. Rinse warm after eating for 3 days. Keep the head higher than the heart tonight. Eat soft bread and broth on the right. If heat climbs along the jaw or a foul taste returns on the 3rd day, find him before sunset, or if he has taken the road to Provence, ask at the bakehouse for the city barber sworn to the wardens. He names the corner. He names the sign. He admits the limits of a fair's medicine. It moves with its drum. This frankness is worth more than his hat. Near the cattle lane you pass the other sort again, the man with the naked stick of iron. He gathers custom by promising painless miracles and by pointing at his hat feather when outcomes disobey. He shows the worm with a strip of soft root wriggling in wine and sells powder that is more chalk than charm. His basin is shallow. His cloths are few. His rope ties men to the chair as if restraint were courage. You keep walking. A woman without coin hesitates, and then drifts toward the careful chair on your recommendation, because the fair spreads good advice by rumor as quickly as it spreads folly. Between drawings, the apprentice keeps a ledger the way merchants do. Towns in the left column, Lagny, Barcerob Province, Troyes, marks for each extraction. A small circle when iron spoke, a cross when a case was refused, a line when a wire steadied a front tooth, a dot when counsel alone sufficed. He will use this to answer a peepouter complaint if one comes, and to bargain a pitch fee with the sergeant next season. Trade and treatment share the same ink. As the sun tilts, small complications knock. A farmer returns, cheek warm, the socket weeping more than the cloth likes. The drawer sits him without the drum, opens with a rinse, and washes until the basin clears. He repacks with wine and a little honey from a vendor 2 lanes over, a familiar trick to quiet a wound that fidgets. He does not reach for iron until washing fails its own test, and when he does, he heats the spatulate nose until it glows a herb bronze rather than a bragging red, touches briefly and withdraws. The smell is not for spectacle. The farmer's color freshens. The pack sits. The crowd breathes out by accident. The drum is still. Near vespers the fair thins to its evening errands. Bankers fold their tables and their rates. The Lombards close strongboxes with click and cord. The apothecary unwinds a cone of sugar for a great house and refuses it to a boy who has only a story to offer. The drawer counts his cloths and decides which will be washed tonight and which will take the road dirty and be boiled at Provence. He wipes the pelican with oil that smells faintly of walnut and smoke. He drops your tooth into a small jar he keeps for returns and for courts, and he asks whether you want it back. You do not. He will carry it until dust asks for it. You taste plain bread and find that your mouth remembers how to chew without bargaining. The noise of the fair falls into a rhythm you can stand beside. Somewhere under canvas, the peepouter bench finishes its last chalk order and yawns. Somewhere, a negligent drawer will drink to his hat. Somewhere, a careful one will wrap his pelican in oilcloth and sleep with the lid on the pail. When a market moves like weather and the healer with the good hand travels with it, what keeps your quiet mouth safe once the drum has crossed the next bridge? And how do you carry that safety with you when the fair's law folds at dusk? Vespers thins the fair to silhouettes. Canvas breathes. Ropes tick in the wind. The ground, stamped flat by trade, exhales the day's heat in a damp sigh. You loiter near the tooth drawer's pitch while he performs the last ceremony a careful craft owes itself, putting things away so tomorrow begins clean. The pelican is wiped with oil that smells of walnut and smoke. Its beak closes with a kiss no louder than cloth on wood. The elevator is rubbed along a strip of linen until its edge shines like a held breath. Hooks are nested beak to curve. The file is knocked once to free a dust no one should carry into another mouth. Cloths divide into 2 fates, those that can be washed in a kettle tonight and those too far gone, tied for the ash pit outside the ditch. He speaks to the apprentice in sentences learned over miles. Oil before road dust. Lid on the pail even when the dogs have given up. Ledger before sleep. The boy repeats each with the obedience of hands learning memory. He enters the day's marks, Troyes, 10 extractions, 2 refusals, 1 wire band, 1 iron, and draws a tiny circle next to the farmer's late bleeding, a reminder to ask after him in the morning. Trade makes its own rosary, each bead a decision that spared someone a worse night. A last visitor comes, hat in hand, a cooper with a swelling that woke after the bench is closed. The drum is silent. The drawer sets a stool nearer the brazier, tests the heat under the jaw with the back of his knuckle and shakes his head at the thought of drawing tonight. He lances the gum as gently as a man short on light can manage, washes with wine until the bowl clears and sets a pack. Morning, he says, not from laziness but from mercy. Night draws iron toward mistakes. He gives the cooper the same dull counsel, warmth, rinse, head high, and adds a promise. He will look for him at Tierce by the peepouter bench. The cooper tips his hat and thanks him as if thanks were a coin he can afford. Around the corner, The other sort advertises a midnight marvel to the drunk. You do not watch. Everyone chooses a teacher even when they do not know they have chosen. You choose the man who puts iron away before boasting. A sergeant pauses, seal glinting like a small moon. He checks that the brazier is banked and the pail's lid is tight. He eyes the ledger the way a baker eyes a tally of flour, not to meddle but because numbers are a language that keeps fares from turning to rumor. Peapotter at prime, he says, 2 cases, both drawers. The careful man nods. He knows one will be a complaint about price, the other about pride disguised as grievance. He sleeps near his tools. Dawn lifts the fare like a curtain. The Peapotter bench begins with a cough and a chalk. A wool merchant argues that the drawer charged him for iron when none was used. The ledger says otherwise. A small circle sits next to the merchant's line. The drawer produces a rag stained the herb bronze of a touched vessel. The sergeant lifts it between 2 fingers and sniffs the faint iron tang. The bench rules for the drawer with the brevity the court is named for. Dusty feet, dusty judgments, clean endings. The second case is worse. The loud drawer broke a molar and left a root like a thorn. He claims the patient jerked. Witnesses claim he yanked. The bench asks for the tooth. None is produced. The careful drawer says nothing. The sergeant finds the loud drawer a fee that will make him quieter for a morning and orders him to return coin. A fare remembers enough to keep its edges from fraying. By mid-morning the cooper returns. The swelling slumps. The drain runs clear. The drawer considers the tooth, tests it with the elevator, stops, and grants another day of softness. Not every evil leaves on command, he says, mostly to his apprentice. Some walk out. He sends the cooper to the apothecary for sage and a pinch of alum, nomming the stall and the price in advance so the cooper's pride can travel safely. Near noon, the fare begins to fold itself back into wagons. Poles come down with a music of rope and breath. Merchants count their seals. A Lombard's clerk scratches rates on a board that will be blank by the next town. The drawer pays his pitch fee in small coins, secures his chest, and ties the stool across the cart so the wood will not hector the iron. He swaps bakery gossip for a cone of yesterday's bread. He tucks the sugar rumor back under its cloth. He gives the apprentice a strip of leather for the road, bitten once at each end by a nervous jaw, and says the boy should keep it near his belt. Not for biting, he adds, for showing. The road to Provence is a film of dust on ankles and a map of ruts in the mind. At a wayside, the drawer checks the pelican again, not because it has changed, but because reassurance is a tool too. He speaks of towns the rope has known. Bar-sur-Aube with its square where a man sells toothpicks carved into tidy cones. Lagny, where a priest swore a saint's name over a cautery as if iron might blush. Provence, whose spring fair smells of wool and vinegar and opportunity. He lists the places he refused to draw because heat ran like a river under the jaw. I keep those lists, he says, so pride keeps quiet. At Provence the business begins again as if time were a wheel that makes its own ruts. The careful drawer stakes a new pitch where the wind carries smoke away from mouths. He hangs his tooth board at a height that says he is here to be found rather than to be applauded. He pays a boy to fetch water, another to keep dogs from the pail, a third to carry messages to those told, not today. He teaches the apprentice to set the stool a hand's breadth closer to the window when the sun moves, so the light will read gums and not flatter them. Work resumes with its ordinary dramas. A journeyman weaver brings a broken crown. The lever turns patient arcs. A child arrives with a front tooth the color of old linen. It is left to wobble out on nature's schedule. A woman asks for a powder to keep the worm at bay. She is sold sage and told to rinse, and the drawer performs the old root and wine twitch with a half-smile that says stories have their uses when they lead toward rinsing and away from desperation. Not every day ends tidy. At week's turn a tinker staggers in with a jaw hot enough to trouble the breath. The drawer does not draw. He lances and washes and sets packs and calls for the iron when bleeding will not be talked down. He touches briefly, sets the iron away, and keeps watch. The apprentice counts breaths the way a choir counts long notes. In the morning the tinker brings a fish as payment. The drawer accepts, not because fish is coin, but because payment makes dignity sit easier in a chair. When the second fare ends, the road leads elsewhere. Perhaps to Bar-le-Duc or to a village where no one paints teeth on boards because bread, not barter, rules the square. The rope is coiled, the drum sleeps, the pelican rides under oilcloth. You walk a little way beside the cart, surprised by how much of your own mouth's quiet is carried in that small roll of iron and rules. Towns will change, laws will modernize, chairs will recline, lights will bloom from metal arms. Yet relief will still be purchased with the same currencies. A lever used with measure, a cloth washed before boast, a ledger that tells the truth. Mobile tents will become vans. Peepwater benches will become forms signed in ballpoint. But a stranger will still steady a stranger's night by learning to move less than he urges and to wait longer than he planned. At dusk, the drawer points at the road's line and says what all traveling healers say when their work goes well enough to return to it tomorrow. There is always another jaw before the next inn. He says it without complaint. The apprentice laughs softly because he is young enough to think the sentence is a song and old enough to know it is a vow. You put your tongue to the place where absence has become ordinary and taste nothing but bread and air. The fare, the rope, the drum, the iron, all of it collapses into this simple permission to forget your mouth for an hour. The cart rattles away, and the dust settles on ruts laid by centuries of feet that bought sleep in coins and courtesies. When the cures of a traveling day have folded into baggage, and the promises of tents are blowing toward the next town, which parts of their quiet law do you carry home, and how do you keep them from fraying when spectacle has moved on? Story 5. Venetian apothecary rinses cloves, alum, and myrrh. You wake to water against stone. Venice speaks in lappings and rope creaks, in a gull's commentary and the slow fold of a market awning along the Rialto. Your jaw has decided to trouble the day. A dull tide under the molar presses outward, patient as the lagoon. You follow the smell that moves through these streets like a quiet promise, wine, vinegar, and spice, and step into a spezieria where the air is warmer than the canal and full of careful names. Shelves climb to the ceiling, blue and white albarelli labeled in a hand that enjoys order. Ac. Rossarum, sir. Violarum, pulv, coral, mirha, illumin. Between them stand tall glass cucurbits and alembics, their bellies holding yesterday's distillations. On the counter rests a brass balance with pans no bigger than saucers, weights nested like saints' days, ounce, dram, scruple, each one the difference between help and waste. The mortar is heavy, the pestle obedient. The apothecary wears indigo linen stained with neatness. His fingers smell of mint and clove. He does not pull teeth. He keeps mouths tolerable until a barber or a surgeon must. He asks when the ache began, whether the gum reddened, whether sleep resisted. He tilts a polished spoon to use like a mirror, lifts the lip and notes the pale flare where the gum swells near the molar. He speaks without drama, warmth first, then washing, then time. He points you to a stool near the brazier where distillations keep their temper and writes a tidy line on a scrap, his recetta, with measures and verbs that belong to this room. Infund, kalu, kohib. He builds the rinse as if it were a prayer said in parts. From a jar labeled salvia, he takes dried sage and bruises it with mint in warm wine until the scent rises. He adds a knife dip of illumin, rock alum, astringent and unromantic, then a pinch of powdered myrrh for bitterness that seems to tidy what it touches. He does not pour clove oil directly. He dips a splinter, lets one drop kiss the bowl and stops. Dear, he says, meaning both price and potency. He draws the infusion off with a small cloth, lets it cool to tooth-safe warmth, and hands you a cup with instructions. Hold, breathe, count to the slow end of a psalm line, spit. He means to rinse the mouth and the hour. Customers cross the threshold as if answering a bell only they can hear. A boatman from Murano asks for vinegar strong enough to close a cut. A monk requests rosewater for the infirmary. A patrician steward buys sugar loaves wrapped like small towers and a syrup for cough. Venice treats sugar as medicine and as luxury and as a rumor that ends in caries. The apothecary sells all three truths with the same scale. He warns the steward, pleasantly, that sweet drinks soothe one trouble and hire another. The steward smiles as people do when told a fact too useful to enjoy. On a high shelf rests a sealed jar of theriac, Venice's own pride, a compounded antidote weighed and compounded before witnesses each year, the mixture strained, sealed with wax and recorded under the eye of magistrates. It is not for teeth, but it teaches the same lesson the room insists upon. Recipes are public obligations here. The Proveditore alla Sanità, health officers who know both plague and fraud, walk this quarter by surprise, lift lids, test weights, and find those who counterfeit strength with chalk and prayers. The apothecary keeps his seals in view and his receipts in order. He welcomes the inspection as a tradesman's liturgy. Your second cup tastes clearer, the basin clouds less. He shows you a small tooth scraper with a swan neck bend and offers to lift a tartar flake that would make any future beak slide. He warns you to reach for a quill or a sliver of orange wood after meals, not to scour with salt as if enamel were a pan. He opens a drawer and lays out powders. Burnt salt, yes, but tempered with ground oyster shell, powdered coral for spenders, a whisper of pumice that flatters more than it helps. He says dentifrices should behave like courtesies. Harshness is only thrift when you polish brass. Through the open door Rialto performs its arithmetic. Porters chant the pace of bales, brokers argue quietly. A spice seller knocks a cone of cinnamon on his palm to release a smell that travels like a story. Cloves appear in small packets today, caravans have been thin, and Portuguese ships bring gossip that takes the price up like a kite. Venice built its syndicate on Mamluk routes through Alexandria. Now ocean tailies curl around the foundations. When clove grows dear, gums learn patience. The apothecary shrugs. He will stretch a drop with mint and counsel, but his ledger hears wind. He is part merchant, part gardener in a city without earth. On the back table he keeps pots of fresh mint and sage growing in grit carried by boat, watered from a glass with the same attention he gives a still. He prefers fresh when he can, dried when he must, and he keeps them separate in his mind as a singer keeps mode and final distinct. He teaches an apprentice to rub a leaf between fingers to smell readiness, to weigh myrrh after pulverizing rather than before, to keep alum dry because damp steals half its virtue. A barber steps in. The two trades braid across the city like ropes, and they exchange a few words with the economy of men who have met pain from opposite ends. The barber buys a dram of clove and a packet of alum. The apothecary asks after a woman whose socket bled 2 nights running. The barber reports that iron spoke briefly and peace followed. They share a short nod that is Venice's version of a psalm. Work done, work to do, hands to keep steady. The apothecary folds your ricetta and tucks it under the jar he will keep for you near the brazier. He marks your name in his book with a small symbol, 2 dots and a line. That means dent. He tells you to return at 6 so he can read the gum again and decide whether patience will hold through vespers, or whether the chair in the barber's window must be asked to speak. He tells you to eat soft bread and avoid the oven's mouth across noon. Bakers here love crust more than molars do. You sit a while with the cup's last warm breath and watch him build other small mercies. A violet syrup is weighed drop by drop into a glass for a child's cough. A jar of ack. Rosarum is unsealed for a woman whose sleep refuses her. A little vinegar steeped with rosemary goes to a sailor for washing a wound he is vague about. Nothing is grand, everything exact. The city outside leverages continents into profit. Inside this room, a man leverages a pinch of alum into minutes without throbbing. Venice knows how to push many levers at once. He shows you before you go a boxwood toothpick case meant to be carried in a sleeve. The lid clicks like a soft conclusion. He gives you 2 quills and a caution, not to draw blood on purpose, not to let pride call harshness cleanliness. He recommends rinsing with warm water after each meal for a week, wine if coin allows, water with sage if not. He does not say infection, he says putrefaction, and you hear the lagoon muttered into a mouth. The bell at San Giacomo plays a little market tune. You step back into the street with your jaw less tyrannical and your day more available. In a city that turns cloves into advice, alum into obedience, and myrrh into the taste of a wound well-mannered, who truly governs what enters your mouth? The apothecary's recipe, the magistrate's seal, or the wind that moves the price of a single drop? Sex leans its light through the shop like a careful hand. The brazier breathes, the cucurbit glass fogs at its shoulder, and the apothecary tests your rinse with the inside of his wrist, as if it were soup meant for a child. You hold, breathe, count to the slow end of a psalm line, and the basin clouds less than it did at morning. He nods, not in triumph but in bookkeeping. He touches your cheek with 3 fingers, notes the heat at the hinge, and lifts your lip with a polished spoon to read the gum's color. Still patience, he says, and writes a short mark in the ledger beside your name, 2 dots and a line, the shop's private sign for teeth with temper. Outside, Rialto argues with its own prosperity. Porters chant to keep step under bales. A rope creaks as a boat noses into its berth. A baker knocks hard crust that your molar wants no part of. Inside, patience is weighed like spice. The apothecary sprinkles a breath of alum into warm wine, bruises 2 new sage leaves between finger and thumb to wake their oil, and lets 1 measured drop of clove find the bowl's surface like a solitary bell. A drop too far wastes coin and dulls mouths, he says, meaning that medicine can be its own appetite if not watched. A knock interrupts the rhythm. 2 officers from the Proveditore alla Sanitas step in with the calm of men who have learned to walk gently where illness and fraud travel the same streets. Their seals, lead discs on cords, tap their belts, a soft punctuation. They look less for drama than for order. Lids are lifted, weights are checked. A jar of theriac is unsealed long enough for a finger's taste and resealed with wax and a neat stamp. They ask for the register of purchases from the last Levantan convoy, cloves, myrrh, cinnamon, and the apothecary produces it without grievance, the way a singer produces a note. They do not accuse, they confirm. They leave a parchment that shows the seal of the day's visit. In a city sown from risks, the habit of inspection is another kind of remedy. When the door closes, the apothecary returns to the small weather inside your jaw. He points to a stool near the open lattice to let the air carry vinegar's breath away. He explains, in a tone meant for apprentices as much as for you, the shop's 3rd-day rule. Day 1. Warmth and washing to persuade swelling to a smaller opinion of itself. Day 2. The same with tartar lifted if the gum allows. Day 3. Decide, continue patience, or ask the barber's window to speak with iron. Cloth before beak always, he says, and the apprentice repeats it with the obedient voice of someone learning to carry a room. Your second rinse tastes almost ordinary. He dries the gum with teased wool and shows you a flake of tartar on a spatula's edge, cloudy and stubborn as an old rumor. He lifts more, delicately, not courting blood. He sets a fresh pack, lint touched with myrrh and disciplined with alum. Sleep higher than your heart, he says, and keep the left side lazy. He draws a slender case from a drawer, a sleeve box for toothpicks of boxwood, and shows you how the lid clicks shut with a temperate sound. He gives you 2 quills and repeats the caution. Scrape gently, pride is not cleanliness. By nones, the room has worked through a dozen small errands that are less about cure than about making the evening less expensive in pain. A gondolier buys rosemary steeped in vinegar for a cut he will not describe. A lace-maker pays for violet syrup with a hand that trembles from late nights. A monk from San Zanipolo bows for rosewater and leaves a list for the infirmary. Sage, mint, alum, myrrh, enough to carry a week of small ailments. The apothecary parcels each with the gravity of a man who knows that a pinch makes an hour behave. When you stand to go, he walks with you to the threshold and points across the bridge toward San Polo. If the night grows warm in the jaw, he says, the barber under the striped pole keeps a steady chair. He speaks Latin to his ledger and plain sense to pain. He describes the window, a basin painted on a board, a stool placed so the light meets gums more honestly than shadows do, a young man with patient shoulders who oils iron before boasting. Tell him I shaved the swelling with wine, he adds, not for credit but to keep a sequence intact. Medicine in Venice is a braid, apothecary, barber, magistrate, each holding an end so the rope will lift. You cross Rialto's stone with the careful mouth of someone eating around an argument. The bridge markets were once crowded with butchers and bakers. Now spice merchants share the arcades with money changers who weigh silver with fingers that smell of ink. A water seller raises his ladle and offers a dipper from a copper bucket. You shake your head, thinking of putrefaction, the apothecary named bluntly, and find the trickle of a side alley instead where a spout runs clear. Venice often teaches you to take the longer path for the smaller risk. San Polo's barber hangs his basin sign where light finds it. Through the window you see the familiar choreography: lint boiled and wrung with tongs, iron wiped with oil, a pelican warming by a brazier only enough to know heat before it is needed. He reads the note the apothecary sent and adds his own entries to a ledger that is as literal as any tax account. Names, teeth, outcomes, iron or cloth. He examines you with the back of a spoon and a question about sleep. He nods at the pack and says, "Good," in the same way the apothecary used the word, meaning we can wait and still be decent. He refuses gently, a nobleman who demands instant drawing for a tooth that only wants 2 more rinses. "Come back a tierce," he says to the nobleman, "with less wine and a better story." You sit a while and watch the barber teach his apprentice the geography of the jaw on a sheep's mandible fetched from a cookshop. Hear the little hole press wrong, and the lip forgets itself. He sketches with a nail the arc a beak must follow to ask a molar to leave with its dignity. He repeats the proverb you are hearing across trades now: "Turn, don't wrench." The apprentice oils the hinge of the pelican until it drinks its share and wipes away what it cannot keep. Afternoon tilts toward vespers, and the city softens its errands. A scribe comes to have a sharp edge filed that has been shaving his tongue for a week. The barber saves him a dozen careless words in the next letter by smoothing that corner. A fishmonger sends a boy with coin for alum. He remembers a bleeding that ended faster for it last season. The barber steps out to buy it from your apothecary. The two exchange nods at the doorway, the kind that pass for ceremony in a town that prefers work to gestures. You return to the spezieria at the hour promised. The basin clouds barely. The gum's red is less theatrical. The apothecary changes the pack and writes a new sign in the ledger, a tiny circle with a tail, his emblem for third day likely calm. He shows you the bottle where your rinse lives, a private jar among hundreds, and tells you it will be kept warm at the edge of the brazier until tomorrow in case the night asks for another measure. He advises soft bread dipped in broth at dusk and a cap over the head in the night breeze. The lagoon sneaks into teeth, he says with a small smile meant for locals. On your way out, you pass a notary arguing gently with a spice broker about a price that rose between convoy and counter. The broker points toward the wind, meaning the ocean, meaning Portugal, meaning that cloves listen to other bells now. The notary shrugs, pays, and pockets a dram that will comfort one mouth and send others to chairs they would not have needed last year. You think of how many small levers Venice pulls and how many of them end in a jaw. Twilight finds you on the fondamenta where air moves quieter than on the bridge. Your jaw sits less high in its opinion of itself. The case in your sleeve clicks when you finger a toothpick. The city glows the color of diluted wine. You count the actors in your small drama: apothecary, barber, magistrate, wind, and try to weigh, as if on a brass balance which one truly governs the next hour of your mouth. The seal on a jar, the beak on a lever, the habit of rinsing, or the price of a drop you cannot control. When the third day arrives, will your patience be enough to finish the cure in warm wine and sage? Or will the barber's window ask you to trade one hard minute for a quieter week? Third morning breaks like pale glass over the canal. You wake with your jaw no longer commanding the room, only clearing its throat now and then. The spezieria takes you in before Rialto has quite found its pace. The brazier hums, the cucurbit sweats. The apothecary warms the rinse against his wrist and watches your face as closely as the bowl. You hold, breathe, count to the slow end of a psalm line. When you spit, the basin clouds hardly at all. He reads your gum the way a pilot reads tide. Color lessened, swelling low, margins clean where yesterday's tartar once kept its stubborn perch. He dries the place with teased wool and lifts a last flake, small as a seed, from the sulcus with a swan neck scraper. He will not court blood for victory. Still patience, he says, and enters a final sign in the ledger beside your name. His tiny circle closed, a tail no longer needed. He explains it for the apprentice's sake, third day calm, and asks if you slept. You did in ordinary minutes, which is how this room measures success. Across the threshold, Venice adds up its errands. Porters chant step under bales. A notary polishes phrasing like brass. A spice broker moves a price with 2 fingers and a shrug toward the wind. The apothecary pours the last of your rinse into a small glass that will live on his shelf for a day, just in case. He folds your recetta and tucks it into the book under the symbol for teeth. Keep the head warm in night air, he says. Rinse after meals this week. He turns the clove bottle in his palm, black seed, far voyage, and says quietly, a drop can govern a whole afternoon. He walks you to the door and points you once more toward the barber's window in San Polo. Let him see the place, he says, for the sake of sequence. You cross Rialto's stone where feet have worn it into a soft argument. You pass a baker cracking crust your molar would have resented yesterday. You pause at a fountain where water runs clear enough to trust. The barber sets his stool so the light reads your mouth honestly. He lifts the pack, nods, and chooses not to touch iron. He files a tiny edge that has annoyed your tongue, a mercy small enough to hide in a syllable. He checks the socket's temper and teaches his apprentice what the apothecary would have said from the other end of the braid. Cloth before beak, beak before iron, iron brief if asked. A nobleman arrives with a story and impatience polished like his shoes. The barber refuses him gently and writes a line in his ledger that means come back at tierce with less wine. He describes your case to the apprentice as an example. Swelling persuaded by warmth, tartar lifted before any lever dared, packs disciplined by alum and myrrh, clove used as a bell, not a drum. He speaks without romance, which is how good rooms keep their promises. At mid-morning, the proveditore alla sanità pass the barber's window on their rounds. They do not enter. They note the oilcloth-wrapped instruments, the boiled linens, the clean basin, the absence of theater. Venice fights plague with galleys and cordons. Your jaw is spared trouble by a ledger and a habit. Each has its magistrate. The officers nod to the striped pole and move on, leaving behind the quiet power of a city that has decided some corners will be checked, whether or not anyone is watching. By noon, you are back at the Spezieria to return the sleeve box he lent you, boxwood case, lid that clicks like a sentence ending kindly. He tells you to keep the quills. He has more. The city has more. Good habits are cheaper than remedies. A boatman buys rosemary vinegar and asks, as the boatmen always do, if the clove price will fall when the next convoy comes. The apothecary lifts his hand, palm flat, meaning tide. When wind consents, he says. You understand that your mouth is tied, however faintly, to a weather that begins months away. He takes down a jar of theriac for another customer and speaks the shop's creed aloud for the apprentice while he weighs. Weigh after you grind, not before. Keep alum dry. Do not pour clove where a splinter will do. Call the barber sooner than your pride suggests. He glances at you as if to underline the last instruction. You nod because the braid has held. Apothecary, barber, magistrate, each keeping the others honest by existing. There is one more errand. In the afternoon, you call at a goldsmith's stall, not for wire, but because the man once wore such a wire and nose restraint. He laughs about the fortnight of pottage that kept a front tooth in place and taps the incisor that now minds its manners. A file, a thread, a week of soup, he says, and I kept my smile. You realize how much of a city's commerce rests on quiet mouths. Words sold cleanly, arguments carried without wince, bargains struck on 2 rows of enamel that do not interrupt themselves. Dusk leans into the fondamenta. You walk where air moves easy over water. Your jaw feels unimportant in the best way, willing to be part of the background again. You imagine, without forcing it, how this same day might happen in another century. The clove bottle becomes eugenol in a labeled vial. The brazier becomes a lighted box that dries wrapped instruments. The striped pole becomes a sign with operating hours and an autoclave spitting clean steam. The third day rule remains, translated into other words. The magistrate's seal becomes a license on a wall. The ledger becomes numbers in a soft glowing square. The drop still governs an afternoon. Patience still governs more than the drop. You stand on a bridge that has survived boat hooks, floods, and arguments, and you let the city pass under you like a long sentence. A woman with a box of sugared almonds laughs and loses one to the canal. A boy chases a paper cone of toothpicks downwind. A monk carries rosewater home to a hall where night breathes carefully. Your own breath is simple again. You taste nothing but wine and air, which is to say, you taste your day without negotiation. When you thank the apothecary the next morning for the last time, he closes the ledger on your name with a knuckle and says only, "Rinse after meals a week, then just water. Keep the cap when the wind is cruel." There is no oath, no benediction, just the closing of a small account between you and a city that likes its recipes public and its cures modest. In a place built on pilings and habit, where a lead seal can quiet a fraud and a single drop can quiet a tooth, which law finally governs the body, statute, recipe, or the discipline to do the little thing again and again until even pain grows bored. You lie back. Somewhere a pelican of iron sleeps on a shelf. Ropes remember hands. A ledger remembers names. Out past the lanterns, the water keeps its own slow counting, and the city of bones goes quiet, one small hinge at a time, as if the night were closing a book someone once read to you by the light of a brazier.